My partner took credit for our viral app, on a stage, under lights, in front of 800 people and a livestream audience of nearly 2 million. He didn't know one thing: I'd coded a backdoor into that app 4 months earlier, quietly, patiently, the way you plant something you hope you'll never need to use. And at the exact moment he stood at the podium calling himself the sole visionary behind it, I crushed it live, in front of everyone, and let the truth do what applause never could. This isn't a story about revenge, not really, even though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. It's a story about what happens when you build something extraordinary with your own hands, hand it to someone you love, and watch him decide, quietly and then not so quietly, that your hands never mattered at all. My name is Elena Marsh, and for 2 years, I built the back end of a social app that eventually reached 11 million users, while the man I loved stood in front of cameras and told the world he'd built it alone. Adrian Voss and I met in our junior year of computer science at a mid-sized university neither of us particularly loved, in a systems design class taught by a professor who assigned group projects with the specific cruelty of someone who'd clearly never had to survive one himself. We were paired together on a semester-long project, building a lightweight app that solved some real, if modest, problem, and from the very first meeting, in a cramped study room that smelled permanently of stale coffee, I understood 2 things about Adrian that would come to define the next 6 years of my life. The first was that he was genuinely brilliant at pitching ideas. He had a gift, rare even among naturally charismatic people, for taking a half-formed concept and describing it back to you in a way that made it sound inevitable, obvious, the kind of idea that was simply waiting in the world for someone smart enough to notice it. He could stand in front of our professor, in front of classmates, in front of anyone, and make even our modest, unremarkable class project sound like the beginning of something enormous. The second thing I understood, more slowly, over the following weeks of actually building that project together, was that Adrian was not, in fact, particularly gifted at the part that made the pitching possible in the first place, the code. He understood systems at a conceptual level, could talk fluently about architecture and user flow and market positioning, but when it came time to actually sit down and write the thing that would run, that would function, that would exist as more than a compelling sentence, that work fell, almost entirely, to me. I didn't mind, not at first. I loved the work itself, the specific, absorbing satisfaction of solving a hard technical problem, watching a system I'd built come alive under my hands. And Adrian's gift for narrative felt, at the time, genuinely complementary to my own quieter, more technical strengths. We made a good team, I told myself, repeatedly, over years, in the specific way you tell yourself things you desperately want to remain true. We started dating 6 months into that partnership, the boundary between collaborators and something more blurring gradually over late nights spent debugging together, over the specific intimacy of building something meaningful side by side. By graduation, we were not just building apps together in our spare time, we told each other and everyone else, building a future together, in every sense of the word. The idea for Halo, the app that would eventually reshape both our lives, in wildly different directions, came to me on an ordinary Tuesday evening, 18 months after graduation, while Adrian and I were both working unfulfilling jobs at different tech companies, still building side projects together most nights and weekends, still nursing the shared dream of eventually building something that was fully, entirely ours. I'd been thinking, for weeks, about the specific loneliness of moving to a new city, something both of us had recently experienced, relocating for our respective jobs, and how strange it was that in an age of endless connectivity, there was no genuinely good way to find people nearby who shared your specific, particular interests in the exact moment you wanted company. Not dating apps, which solved a different problem entirely. Not generic social networks, which connected you to people you already knew rather than people you didn't yet know but might genuinely enjoy meeting. I sketched the core concept that night, at our shared kitchen table, in the specific fever of an idea that felt, immediately, unmistakably right, a location-based app that matched people in real time based on shared microinterests, not broad categories like music or hiking, but granular, specific compatibility, the kind that might connect two strangers both wandering the same neighborhood at the same hour, both craving the same obscure ramen place, both willing to talk for 20 minutes. About a niche podcast almost no one else they knew had heard of. "This is really something," Adrian said, reading over my shoulder as I sketched the architecture, and I remember feeling, in that moment, a warm, uncomplicated flood of validation, the specific joy of building something with the person you loved, watching his face light up with genuine excitement at what I'd made. I want to be clear about the division of labor over the following year, because it matters enormously to what happened later. I built the entire back-end architecture, the matching algorithm, the real-time location processing, the specific, technically difficult work of making the app function smoothly at scale. I wrote, over the course of that year, easily 80% of the app's actual codebase, working nights and weekends around my day job, teaching myself new frameworks as I went, solving problems that kept me up until 3 in the morning more nights than I could count. Adrian handled the front-end design, working with a freelance designer he found to translate my technical architecture into something visually clean and appealing. He handled early user testing, gathering feedback from friends and acquaintances. And he handled, with genuine skill, the narrative, the pitch deck, the branding, the specific art of describing Halo to potential investors and early users in a way that made it sound as compelling as it actually, technically was. It felt, for most of that year, like a genuine partnership. I built the engine. He built the story around it. Together, we launched. Halo launched quietly, in beta, to about 2,000 users in 3 test cities, 18 months after that first sketch at our kitchen table. For the first 3 months, growth was modest, encouraging but unremarkable, the kind of slow, steady traction that suggested we might have built something genuinely useful, without yet suggesting we'd built something that would reshape both our lives. The shift happened almost overnight, the way these things sometimes do, triggered by a single viral video, a user in Austin who'd matched with someone through Halo based on a shared, obscure obsession with a specific decade of jazz, and had posted a video of their spontaneous, delighted meeting that accumulated 11 million views in 4 days. Downloads exploded. Press coverage followed within the week. By the end of that month, Halo had grown from 2,000 beta users to over 400,000 active accounts, with growth curves that made investors who'd previously passed on us suddenly, urgently interested. I want to describe what those months actually felt like, from the inside, because I think it matters to understanding everything that came after. It felt like drowning in the best possible way, an overwhelming, exhilarating flood of servers that needed scaling, bugs that needed fixing at 3 in the morning as our infrastructure strained under load no one had anticipated, features that needed building faster than seemed humanly possible. I was, during those months, working close to 80 hours a week, solving technical problems that had never existed before at this scale, essentially rebuilding significant portions of the app's architecture in real time while it was actively being used by hundreds of thousands of people. Adrian, during those same months, was doing something different, though I didn't fully register the shape of it until much later. He was doing press. He was doing investor meetings. He was doing the specific, visible, front-facing work of representing Halo to the outside world, work that was genuinely valuable, work I couldn't have done nearly as well myself, but work that was also, unmistakably, more visible than mine, more photographable, more easily narrated into a single compelling story about a single compelling founder. I remember the first article that described Halo as Adrian Boss's brainchild, in a mid-tier tech publication covering our seed funding round. I remember reading it in bed, late at night, after a 16-hour day spent fixing a critical bug in our matching algorithm, and feeling a small, cold flicker of something I didn't yet have language for. "Did you see this?" I asked Adrian, showing him the article. "Yeah, they got some details wrong," he said, barely glancing up from his own laptop. "I'll reach out to the reporter, get it corrected." He did not, as far as I ever discovered, reach out to the reporter. The correction never came. And that article, small and easily dismissed as a one-off mistake at the time, turned out to be the first thread in a pattern I wouldn't fully understand for another 18 months. I want to walk through this pattern carefully, because I think it's important to understand how gradual it was, how each individual moment could be, and was, by me, repeatedly, explained away, while the accumulated shape of it told a very different story. 6 weeks after that first article, Halo closed a series of funding round, $12 million from a well-known venture firm, coverage in 3 major tech publications. Every single article named Adrian as co-founder and CEO. 2 of the 3 mentioned me by name in a single sentence, usually somewhere in the 4th or 5th paragraph, describing me as co-founder and lead engineer. 1 didn't mention me at all. I remember bringing this up with Adrian, gently, over dinner one evening, trying to keep my voice light, curious rather than accusatory. "I noticed the TechCrunch piece didn't mention me," I said. "Was that intentional, or just an oversight on their part?" "I think I just talked more about the technical vision in broad strokes during that interview," Adrian said. "I didn't get into the specific architecture stuff, so maybe that's why they didn't feel the need to bring you in specifically. I can mention it next time." I believed him. I want to be honest about that, I genuinely, fully believed him, because the alternative explanation felt, at the time, unthinkable. This was the man I loved, the man I'd built 2 years of my life alongside, the man who had, in the earliest days, celebrated my technical work with what had felt like genuine, unguarded pride. It didn't occur to me, not seriously, not yet, that the erasure might be deliberate rather than accidental. The pattern continued, though, month after month, article after article, interview after interview. Adrian appeared on 3 separate tech podcasts over the following year, discussing Halo's origin story, its technical architecture, its future roadmap, in interviews that ran anywhere from 30 minutes to over an hour. In none of them, not once, across a combined nearly 3 hours of recorded conversation, did he mention my name. I noticed it happening in smaller ways too, at industry events, where Adrian would be introduced as the founder of Halo while I stood beside him, introduced, if at all, as Adrian's partner, a phrase that could technically refer to either romantic or professional partnership and was, I began to suspect, deployed with exactly that convenient ambiguity in mind. I noticed it in our own internal company materials, gradually revised over 18 months, where org charts that had once listed us as co-founders with equal titles slowly, incrementally shifted to list Adrian as founder and CEO and me as head of engineering, a title change so gradual, so quietly implemented, that I didn't fully register it had happened until I found an old version of the document, months later, and compared the 2 side by side. I finally confronted Adrian directly about 18 months after that first small warning sign, on a rare quiet evening when we weren't both buried in work, sitting on the couch in the apartment we still shared, in the specific, careful tone I'd rehearsed in my head for weeks before finally finding the courage to actually say it out loud. "I need to talk to you about something that's been bothering me," I said. "The way Halo's story gets told. In the press, at events, even internally now. It's becoming your app, Adrian. Not our app. And I built most of the actual technology that makes it work. Adrian's face did something complicated, a flicker of something that might have been guilt or might have simply been surprise at being confronted directly, quickly smoothed over into a practiced, reasonable expression. I don't think that's fair, he said. I've never claimed sole credit. I always say we when I talk about the founding story. If reporters simplify it, if they focus more on me because I'm the one doing the interviews, that's not really something I can control. You could correct them, I said. You could insist on it. You could bring me into more of the press conversations instead of always being the one who does them alone. You could stop letting internal documents quietly downgrade my title without ever discussing it with me first. I didn't downgrade your title, Adrian said, his voice taking on a defensive edge now. Head of Engineering is a real, important title. It's not a downgrade. And honestly, Elena, I think you're reading a lot of intention into things that are mostly just how the media works. Founders get more attention than engineers. That's not me erasing you. That's just how tech journalism functions. I want to be honest that this conversation, and several others like it over the following months, followed almost exactly the same shape every time I would raise a specific, documented concern, and Adrian would offer a reasonable-sounding explanation for that specific instance, while somehow never addressing the accumulated pattern I was actually describing. Each individual tree, examined alone, looked defensible. The forest, which I could see clearly and which he seemed genuinely unable or unwilling to see at all, told a very different story. I built this app, Adrian, I said finally, my voice cracking slightly, the frustration of 18 months finally breaking through the careful, reasonable tone I'd been trying to maintain. I wrote most of the code. I'm the reason it actually works, the reason it scaled, the reason it didn't collapse under its own growth in the first month. I need the story that gets told about Halo to reflect that. Not perfectly. Not obsessively. Just honestly. I hear you, Adrian said, in a tone that suggested, unmistakably, that he did not, in fact, hear me, or that hearing me had not produced any genuine intention to change. I'll be more mindful going forward. He was not, in any meaningful sense, more mindful going forward. The invitation arrived 9 months later, an email from a well-known TED conference, inviting Adrian to give an 18-minute talk on the future of human connection in a digital age, built around Halo's origin story and technical philosophy. It was, by any reasonable measure, an enormous opportunity, the kind of platform that could meaningfully shift the trajectory of the company, of both our careers, of everything we'd built together. Adrian was ecstatic, understandably. I remember him reading the invitation aloud to me, his voice bright with genuine excitement, and I remember feeling, despite everything that had accumulated between us over the previous 2 years, a flicker of the old warmth, the shared joy of watching something we'd built together receive this kind of recognition. This is huge, he said. This could change everything for us. I noticed the word us, and some small, hopeful part of me chose, deliberately, to believe it meant what it sounded like it meant. Are you going to talk about the technical architecture? I asked. About how the matching algorithm actually works? I could help you prepare that section, make sure it's accurate. Absolutely, Adrian said. I want this talk to really honor everything that went into building Halo. Both of us. I helped him prepare for that talk over the following 6 weeks, more intensively than I'd helped with any previous press appearance, genuinely believing, wanting to believe, at the very least, that this might be the moment the pattern finally, meaningfully shifted. I wrote detailed technical explanations he could draw on. I reviewed his drafts, offering corrections and clarifications. I stayed up late, multiple nights, helping him refine the specific language he'd used to describe the matching algorithm's underlying architecture I had designed and built, largely alone, over 18 exhausting months. I want to describe the specific moment, 3 weeks before the talk, when the old, familiar doubt returned, sharper and more concrete than it had ever been before. I was reviewing what Adrian told me was his near-final draft of the talk, and found, in the opening section, the part describing Halo's origin, a story that had subtly, significantly shifted from the one we'd actually lived. In this version, Adrian described the initial concept for Halo as something he'd sketched out one night, described building the first working prototype himself over a few intense weeks, and described me, when he mentioned me at all, in a single sentence deep in the technical section, as someone who'd helped refine the algorithm. I sat with that draft for a long time, feeling something inside me go very quiet and very still, the specific, familiar stillness I would later come to recognize as the moment fear or hurt transforms, silently, into resolve. "This isn't accurate," I told him, showing him the specific passages. I sketched the original concept. I built the first prototype, entirely alone, before you were even involved in the technical side. The algorithm isn't something I helped refine, I designed it and built it from scratch. "I'm just simplifying the story for a general audience," Adrian said, a defensiveness in his voice that had grown sharper, less patient, over the preceding months. TED Talks need a clean narrative. A single hero's journey. It's not that I don't value what you did, Elena. It's just not how this format works. Then don't take credit for the parts that were mine, I said. Say we. Say my co-founder. Say anything that's actually true. I'll think about how to phrase it, Adrian said, in the specific, familiar tone that I now understood, with painful clarity, meant he had no intention of actually changing anything at all. I want to explain, carefully, what I did next, because I think the mechanics of it matter as much as the motivation. 4 months before that TED Talk was even scheduled, long before I knew the invitation was coming, in fact, I had, during a routine security audit of Halo's codebase, built a small, isolated administrative function into the app's core system. I want to be honest that I hadn't built it with any specific malicious intent at the time. I'd built it, genuinely, as an emergency kill switch, a way to instantly, safely disable the app's live functionality in the event of a critical security breach or catastrophic bug, something responsible engineers build into systems at scale as a matter of standard practice, a fail-safe most users would never know existed and would, ideally, never need to see triggered. The function required a specific authentication sequence, known only to me, buried in a part of the codebase Adrian had never had the technical fluency to fully review or understand. It was legitimate infrastructure, defensible on every professional and ethical ground. Every large-scale application needs this kind of emergency control, and as the engineer who'd built and maintained Halo's entire back-end, I was well within my rights, and my responsibilities, to have built it. What I hadn't originally anticipated was the specific way I would eventually choose to use it. The night before Adrian's TED Talk, lying awake beside a man I no longer fully recognized as the partner I'd once built this entire company alongside, I made a decision that had been slowly, quietly forming for months, crystallizing finally into something clear and deliberate. I decided that if Adrian stood on that stage and told the world, unambiguously, that he alone had built what I had, in fact, built primarily with my own hands, I would not let that lie stand uncorrected in front of 2 million people. I didn't plan sabotage in any broad, destructive sense. I planned something narrower, more precise, more directly tied to the specific injustice unfolding. If Adrian's talk reached the section where he described building the app's technical architecture himself, I would trigger, briefly, a visible, undeniable system failure, timed specifically to that moment, impossible to explain away as coincidence to anyone who later reviewed the timeline, but also, crucially, harmless, fully reversible, causing no permanent damage to the app, its users, or its data. I wanted the truth to interrupt the lie at the exact moment the lie was being told. I wanted it to happen in front of the largest possible audience, the specific audience Adrian had assembled specifically to cement, publicly and permanently, a story that erased me. The talk took place on a Thursday afternoon, in a packed auditorium, Adrian in a sharp navy suit, walking onto the stage to warm, expectant applause, the specific lighting and production values of an event designed to make even ordinary observations sound profound. I watched from the front row, having been invited, with what I now understood as a particular, almost cruel irony, as the founder's partner, a seat reserved, prominently, visibly, for a woman the talk itself was about to systematically erase. Adrian opened with a story about loneliness, about moving to a new city, about the specific ache of wanting connection in an age of endless, hollow digital contact, the exact story, almost word for word, that I had first described to him at our kitchen table, years earlier, as the seed of everything Halo eventually became. I remember the night the idea hit me, Adrian said, 18 minutes stretching toward its central section, the room hanging on his words with the particular, rapt attention a skilled speaker can command. I sat down and sketched out, essentially, the entire architecture that Halo still runs on today. I built the first working prototype myself, over a few intense weeks, teaching myself the technical frameworks I needed as I went. I felt my hand tighten around my phone, resting in my lap, my thumb finding the specific sequence of taps I had rehearsed, alone, in my apartment, more times than I wanted to admit. The matching algorithm at the heart of Halo, Adrian continued, is, I think, genuinely one of the more elegant pieces of technical architecture I've ever built. It processes, I triggered the sequence. The large screen behind him, which had been displaying a live, real-time visualization of Halo's global user activity, a specific, dramatic visual element Adrian himself had requested for the talk, wanting the audience to see, in real time, the scale of what he was describing, flickered, stuttered, and went dark, replaced by a stark, unmistakable system error message, visible to the entire auditorium and to the nearly 2 million people watching the livestream. Adrian froze, mid-sentence, staring at the darkened screen behind him, and I watched, from the front row, as confusion crossed his face, followed quickly by something closer to panic. "We seem to be having some technical difficulties," he said, attempting, with visibly fraying composure, to recover his rhythm. "The app itself is completely stable. This is just a display issue with the error message on screen did not, in fact, describe a display issue. It described, in the specific, technical language I had deliberately chosen, an authentication failure in the core matching algorithm, the exact system Adrian had, 30 seconds earlier, just claimed sole credit for having built." A woman in the audience, sitting close enough to the stage to read the error message clearly, raised her phone, and I watched, in real time, the specific, unmistakable ripple of people in the crowd beginning to photograph the screen, beginning to whisper to each other, beginning, unmistakably, to notice the specific irony of the moment unfolding in front of them. I stood up from my seat. I don't fully remember deciding to walk toward the stage. I remember, instead, the specific, dreamlike clarity of finding myself already moving, the auditorium's attention shifting, gradually and then completely, from the darkened screen to the woman rising from the front row and walking toward the microphone stand positioned, conveniently, at the base of the stage stairs. I'm sorry to interrupt, I said, my voice carrying, unamplified, but clear enough in the suddenly, completely silent room. My name is Elena Marsh. I'm Halo's co-founder and lead engineer. I built the matching algorithm Adrian just described, designed it, wrote it, maintained it, alone, over 18 months. What you're seeing on that screen right now is an authentication failure in a system I built, that I have sole administrative access to, and that I chose, deliberately, to trigger at this exact moment. The room's silence took on a different quality, no longer confused, but charged, attentive, the specific silence of an audience that suddenly, collectively understands it is witnessing something unplanned, something real. I want to be honest about why I did this, I continued, my voice steadying with each sentence, the months of accumulated frustration finally finding, at last, a clear and deliberate outlet. For 2 years, Adrian has told the story of this app as though he built it alone. He didn't. I built the back-end architecture, the matching algorithm, the entire technical infrastructure that makes Halo function. He built the narrative around it, and he built it well, but a narrative isn't a company, and a pitch isn't a product. I am not standing up here because I want revenge. I'm standing up here because the truth deserves to be told in the same room where the lie was just told, and I wasn't willing to let this particular lie stand uncorrected in front of the largest audience it's ever been told to. Adrian, still standing on the stage behind me, said nothing for a long moment, his face pale under the stage lights, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out smaller than the confident, polished cadence he'd opened the talk with. Elena, this isn't the place, this is exactly the place, I said, turning to face him directly, the crowd fading, briefly, into background noise around the two of us. You chose this stage to tell a story that erased me. I'm choosing this same stage to correct it. If you'd simply told the truth, said we, credited the work accurately, none of this would have happened. This is the direct, natural consequence of the story you decided to tell. I turned back to the audience, took a breath, and continued, more calmly now, the sharpest edge of adrenaline beginning to settle into something steadier. I'm not here to destroy this company. I love what we built, genuinely, more than I can easily express. I'm here because I refuse to let my work be erased for the sake of a cleaner, more marketable single-founder narrative. If any of you are here representing investors, or press, or simply curious members of the public, I'm happy to answer any technical questions about Halo's actual architecture, in detail, right now. I built it. I can speak to every part of it. The immediate aftermath was, predictably, chaotic, conference organizers rushing the stage, a hurried, awkward transition to the next scheduled speaker, a swarm of press and audience members converging on both Adrian and me before we'd even fully left the building, phones raised, questions overlapping. I answered what I could, calmly, factually, sticking closely to verifiable technical claims, the specific systems I'd built, the specific timeline of development, careful never to veer into speculation about Adrian's motivations, letting the documented facts speak for themselves rather than dressing them up in accusation. The video of the moment, the darkened screen, my walk to the microphone, the specific, quiet clarity of my statement, went viral within hours, eventually surpassing, by a wide margin, the views the talk itself would have received under ordinary circumstances. Tech journalists who had, for 2 years, uncritically repeated Adrian's single-founder narrative began, rapidly, digging into Halo's actual history, cross-referencing old commit histories, patent filings, early investor documents, all of which, unambiguously, confirmed exactly what I'd said on that stage. Within a week, 3 separate investigative pieces had been published, each one methodically documenting the pattern of erasure I'd lived through for 2 years, the gradually shifting titles, the interviews where I'd gone unmentioned, the specific, quiet editing of internal company narratives that had slowly, deliberately repositioned me from co-founder to subordinate engineer. Adrian issued a public statement 2 days after the talk, an apology that acknowledged, in careful, lawyer-reviewed language, that the narrative around Halo's founding has not always fully reflected Elena Marsh's essential technical contributions, a sentence so carefully hedged, so visibly crafted to minimize legal exposure rather than express genuine accountability, that it did little to slow the momentum of public opinion, which had, by that point, decisively shifted in my favor. Our company's board, which included, notably, 2 investors who had, I would later learn, harbored private concerns about Adrian's leadership style for some time, called an emergency meeting within the week. I want to be honest that I did not orchestrate what happened next, though I understand why some later coverage assumed I had. The board, independently, reviewing the mounting evidence and the specific, public relations catastrophe unfolding around Halo's leadership, voted to remove Adrian as CEO, offering me the position instead, a decision I accepted, after careful consideration, 3 weeks later. I want to correct a common misconception about how this story is often told, because I think the accurate version matters more than the satisfying one. I did not, in fact, remain CEO of the original company for long. Adrian, in the weeks following his removal, moved quickly to consolidate his remaining control over the company's cap table, using provisions in our original founding agreement, provisions I had, admittedly, never fully understood the implications of, having trusted, for years, that our shared history made careful legal scrutiny of our own founding documents unnecessary. I left Halo 4 months after that TED Talk, not pushed out exactly, but recognizing, with clear eyes, that remaining in a company where Adrian retained significant board influence and residual leverage was not a sustainable path forward, regardless of my formal title. What I did instead was start something new. I founded Compass, a company built, from its very first day, on the technical architecture I understood better than anyone alive, refined and improved with everything I'd learned building and scaling Halo, but designed, this time, without Adrian, without the compromise of a partnership that had, in the end, cost me far more than it had ever given back. I brought with me 2 engineers from Halo's original team, both of whom had privately reached out in the weeks following the TED Talk, expressing quiet, long-held frustrations of their own about how credit and recognition had been distributed within the company. The investor interest was, in the immediate aftermath of the TED Talk story going viral, significant and immediate. I want to be honest that I approached these conversations with real caution, having learned, at real cost, the specific danger of letting a compelling narrative substitute for careful, honest partnership. I chose investors deliberately, prioritizing those who demonstrated genuine understanding of and respect for the technical work at the heart of what I was building, rather than simply chasing the largest possible valuation from whoever was most eager to capitalize on the viral moment. Compass launched 14 months later, an evolution of the same core matching technology I'd built for Halo, refined with everything I'd learned, marketed honestly, from its very first press release, as founded and built by Elena Marsh, the engineer behind Halo's original technical architecture, language I insisted on, explicitly, in every piece of company communication, having learned, permanently, the cost of leaving that particular story open to convenient revision by anyone else. Compass grew more slowly than Halo had, in its earliest viral months, a deliberate choice on my part, prioritizing sustainable infrastructure and genuine user trust over the kind of explosive, difficult-to-manage growth that had nearly broken Halo's systems in its first frantic weeks. But it grew steadily, consistently, and within 2 years, had surpassed Halo's own user base, helped along, I'll admit honestly, by a wave of users who had followed the public story closely and wanted, specifically, to support the company built by the engineer who'd told the truth rather than the founder who'd tried to erase her. Halo itself, under Adrian's continued leadership, struggled significantly in the months following the scandal. Investor confidence, once the specific, documented pattern of credit erasure became public, proved considerably harder to rebuild than I imagine Adrian had anticipated. 2 planned funding rounds fell through. Key engineering staff, uneasy about the company's culture and leadership in the aftermath of everything that had come to light, departed for competitors, several of them eventually joining Compass directly. Within 18 months, Halo had been quietly acquired by a larger competitor, at a valuation significantly below what it had commanded at its peak, and Adrian's name faded, gradually, from the specific kind of press coverage he had once cultivated so carefully. I didn't take particular satisfaction in Halo's decline, if I'm honest. I'd built too much of myself into that app, over too many exhausting, meaningful months, to feel genuine pleasure watching it falter under someone else's stewardship. What I felt, instead, watching Compass grow steadily under my own leadership, was something quieter and more durable than satisfaction, the specific, hard-won relief of finally, fully owning the story of my own work, without needing anyone else's permission or narrative framing to make that ownership real. I want to describe one particular meeting from Compass's early fundraising, because I think it captures something important about what actually changed in me over the course of this entire experience. 6 weeks after that TED Talk, still raw from everything that had happened, I met with a venture capitalist named Marisol Chen, widely respected in the industry for her technical background, a rare quality among investors, most of whom evaluated technology companies through a purely financial lens rather than genuine understanding of the underlying engineering. I watched the video, Marisol said, early in our meeting, with a directness I appreciated immediately. I want to ask you something honestly, and I want an honest answer. Are you starting Compass because you have a genuinely strong technical vision for it, or are you starting it because you're angry, and this is the most visible way to prove a point? I sat with that question for a long moment, appreciating, genuinely, that she'd asked it directly rather than letting it linger unspoken beneath a more conventional pitch meeting. Both, honestly, I said. I won't pretend the anger isn't part of my motivation. But the anger isn't what will make Compass successful. The technical vision is. I've spent 6 years building matching and connection technology. I understand this specific technical problem better than almost anyone else building in this space right now. The TED Talk moment is what made people pay attention to me. But it's not why Compass will succeed, if it succeeds. It'll succeed because I know exactly what I'm building, and exactly why it matters, independent of anyone else's story about me. Marisol studied me for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, smiled. That's the answer I needed to hear, she said. I've seen a lot of founders ride a viral moment into a company that doesn't actually have anything real underneath it. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think you're the real thing, and the TED Talk just happened to be the moment the world finally noticed. Compass secured its seed round from Marisol's firm 3 weeks later, the first of several investments that would eventually fund the company's full development and launch. I speak, occasionally now, at university computer science programs, at industry conferences, at events specifically focused on supporting women in technical roles. Invitations that increased significantly in the years following the TED Talk, though I've been careful, deliberately, to build a speaking practice around genuine technical substance rather than simply retelling the viral moment that first brought me visibility. The most common question I receive, in nearly every one of these talks, is some version of the same thing: how do you protect your work, and your credit for it, in a partnership, romantic, professional, or both, where the other person controls the narrative more skillfully than you do? I've thought carefully about how to answer that question honestly, because I think the easy, satisfying answer, build a backdoor, crash the presentation, let the truth interrupt the lie, is not, in fact, a sustainable or generalizable strategy, and I'm wary of anyone walking away from my story believing it should be. Document everything, I tell them instead. Not because you're planning sabotage, but because clear documentation is the foundation of being able to advocate for yourself credibly, if and when advocacy becomes necessary. Keep your own record of what you built, when you built it, what decisions you made and why. Insist on accurate titles and accurate credit from the very beginning, before informal patterns calcify into permanent narratives. And pay close attention, early and consistently, to whether the story being told about your shared work is actually the true one, not because a single inaccurate mention means catastrophe, but because patterns, over time, tell you something true about how someone actually sees your contribution, regardless of what they say when you ask them directly. I tell them, too, about the specific cost of staying silent for as long as I did, 18 months of gradually accumulating erasure, addressed too gently, too many times, before I finally found the clarity and the courage to act decisively. I don't regret standing up on that stage, I tell them. But I do wish I'd trusted my own observations sooner, rather than needing 18 months of accumulating evidence before I finally believed what I'd been seeing clearly the whole time. Compass, 3 years after its launch, employs over 200 people, serves nearly 9 million active users, and has, in the specific metric I find myself caring about most, a workplace culture I built deliberately, from its very first hire, around transparent, accurate credit for technical work, every engineer's contributions documented clearly, every press mention reviewed for accuracy, every internal document maintained with the specific, careful honesty I once wished, desperately, someone had extended to me. I still think about Adrian sometimes, not often, and rarely with the sharp, immediate anger I once carried in the months following that TED Talk. I heard, through mutual industry contacts, that he'd eventually taken a role as an advisor at a much smaller startup, his public profile considerably diminished from its peak, his name now inextricably, permanently linked, in any search of his professional history, to the specific story of the woman he tried to erase and the stage where she refused to let that erasure stand. I don't know if he's found peace with how things unfolded. I've made a deliberate choice not to seek out that information, recognizing, at some point in my own healing, that his internal experience of these events was no longer mine to track or manage or worry about. What I do know, with complete certainty, is my own answer to the question that used to keep me awake during those exhausting, uncertain months of building Halo alongside someone who would eventually try to claim it as entirely his own. I know, now, with absolute clarity, exactly what I built, exactly what it took to build it, and exactly who deserves the credit. I don't need a stage, or a viral video, or anyone else's validation to know that truth anymore. I know it because I lived it, hour by exhausting hour, line of code by line of code, for years before anyone else ever thought to ask. I want to tell you about a specific hire at Compass, because I think it illustrates something important about what I actually learned from everything that happened with Adrian, not just the caution, but the deeper, more generative lesson underneath it. About a year into Compass's growth, I interviewed a young engineer named Priyanka Rao for a senior back-end role, a woman who reminded me, almost uncomfortably, of myself at 26, brilliant technically, visibly uncomfortable with self-promotion, the kind of engineer who let her work speak for itself and assumed, with a kind of quiet, misplaced confidence, that quality alone would always be recognized fairly. "Tell me about a project you're proud of," I asked her, partway through the interview, watching her describe, in careful, technically precise detail, a complex distributed systems project she'd led at her previous company. "It went really well," she said, finishing her explanation. "My team lead ended up presenting it at our company's all-hands, which was great visibility for the whole team. Something in the specific phrasing caught my attention, the way she described the visibility as belonging to the whole team rather than specifically to herself, despite having just described, in detail, work that sounded, unmistakably, like something she had personally architected and led. Who actually designed the distributed systems architecture? I asked her directly. I did, she said, with a flicker of surprise at the direct question. But my team lead is really good at presenting technical work to non-technical stakeholders, so it made sense for him to take that piece. I recognized, hearing that sentence, an exact echo of the reasoning I had once offered myself, repeatedly, across 2 years of building Halo alongside Adrian, the same generous, self-effacing logic that had once allowed me to explain away a pattern I should have named and addressed far earlier than I did. I hired Priyanka that week, and over the following months, made a specific, deliberate point of ensuring her name appeared, consistently and prominently, in every piece of internal and external communication describing work she'd actually led, not as an act of special treatment, but as the same standard of accurate credit I'd built Compass's entire culture around from its founding. You don't have to let someone else become the face of your work just because they're more comfortable presenting it, I told her, over coffee, a few months into her tenure, watching her prepare for her first external conference talk, the kind of visible, career-defining opportunity one wished, retroactively, someone had actively pushed me toward far earlier in my own career. You can learn to be your own advocate. It's a skill, not a personality trait. I had to learn it the hard way. I'd rather you learn it here, deliberately, before anyone else gets the chance to make that decision for you. Priyanka gave that conference talk herself, 3 months later, describing her own architecture in her own words, and I watched from the audience with a specific, quiet pride that had very little to do with Compass's business metrics and everything to do with the particular, hard-won satisfaction of helping someone else avoid 18 months of the exact erasure I had once lived through myself. There's one piece of this story I haven't shared publicly before, in any of the interviews or talks I've given since that TED stage, a letter I drafted, 8 months after everything happened, addressed to Adrian, that I ultimately decided never to send. I wrote it during a particularly difficult stretch of building Compass, exhausted from fundraising and hiring and the specific, grinding work of building a company from nothing for the second time in my career, in a mood I can only describe as unexpectedly reflective rather than angry. I found myself, that night, wanting to articulate something I hadn't fully said, even to myself, in all the months of public statements and careful, factual interviews. The letter, which I still have saved in a folder I rarely open, said something close to this: I don't think you set out to erase me, not consciously, not with the kind of deliberate cruelty that would be easier to simply hate. I think you found a story that worked better for you, cleaner, more marketable, easier to tell in 30-second sound bites, and you let yourself believe it, gradually, the same way people often let themselves believe convenient things. That doesn't make what happened acceptable. It doesn't undo 18 months of watching myself disappear from a story I built with my own hands. But I don't carry the specific hatred toward you that people sometimes assume I do, when they hear this story secondhand. I carry something more like grief, for the partnership I thought we had, for the version of you I once genuinely loved, who might have been capable of sharing credit honestly if the temptation to simplify, to claim more than was his, had never presented itself so easily. I never sent that letter, in the end, deciding, after several days of consideration, that sending it would serve my own need for closure more than it would serve any genuine purpose in Adrian's life, and that seeking closure through his response, whatever that response might have been, would have meant handing him, once again, a kind of power over my own healing that I had worked too hard, by that point, to reclaim entirely for myself. I share this now, for the first time, not because I think Adrian deserves this level of continued attention in my story, but because I think it's important for anyone reading this to understand that the clean, satisfying arc of He wronged me, I triumphed. The story is simple isn't quite the whole truth of how these things actually feel, lived through in real time. There was grief in it. There was genuine love, once, that made the eventual betrayal cut deeper than it would have from a stranger. The satisfaction of Compass's success, of watching Halo falter, of finally being credited accurately for my own work, all of that was real, and meaningful, and hard-won. But it existed alongside something more complicated, too, and I think pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty, in a story that is, at its core, entirely about the cost of dishonesty. If you're reading this, and you recognize yourself in my story, in the work you built with your own hands, slowly, quietly erased from a story someone else found more convenient to tell alone, I want you to know something. Your work does not become less real because someone else tells the story of it more skillfully than you do. The narrative someone builds around a project is not the same as the project itself, and no amount of polished storytelling can genuinely, permanently erase the truth of what you actually built, with your own hands, over your own exhausting hours. Trust the pattern you're seeing, even when each individual instance seems small enough to explain away. Document your work. Insist on accurate credit, early and often, before silence calcifies into a permanent, convenient story that isn't true. And if you ever find yourself standing where I once stood, watching someone claim, publicly and confidently, credit for something that was never fully theirs to claim, know that the truth, spoken clearly and factually, in the right moment, is more powerful than any polished narrative built to obscure it. I built something extraordinary. Someone tried to take the credit for it. And in the end, the truth outlasted the applause, exactly the way it always eventually does, for anyone patient enough, and brave enough, to make sure it finally gets heard. I think, often, about that image, the darkened screen behind him, the specific silence of a room realizing it was witnessing something unrehearsed and true. I don't think of it anymore as a moment of destruction, though I understand why it looked that way from the outside, why headlines described it as a crash, a sabotage, a scandal. I think of it, instead, as the moment I finally, fully stopped asking permission to exist in my own story. Everything I built afterward, Compass, the culture I created there, the engineers I've since helped avoid the exact erasure I once lived through, grew directly out of that single, decisive choice to let the truth interrupt the lie, in front of everyone, once and for all. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the truth is always worth the interruption. See you in the next one.